I'm going to suggest, as far as a good starting point as you're developing your philosophy of biblical application, is this three-phase understanding of scriptural application. The first phase that I'm suggesting is to really understand whatever example, whatever prohibition, whatever truth or promise that it is you're going to try and apply to your life. The first thing is to understand it in its historical cultural context. Now, let me give you an example. Paul tells his audience in 1 Timothy that he doesn't want women to braid themselves or to adorn themselves with braids and gold or pearls, and so that's the imperative we want to apply to ourselves. Now, what we have to understand is that when he tells women not to adorn themselves with braided hair, what that meant in its original historical context is not what braided hair means in our context today. In Paul's day, braided hair meant you were spending a lot of money and time to make yourself appealing. That's not the same meaning braided hair has in our culture today. Now, it could, because we live in a multicultural context, but for example, in San Diego, your average person you run into the streets, having braided hair usually doesn't mean you spend a ton of money on it. It just means you woke up and braided your hair. In Paul's context, it did mean you were spending a lot of money and you were really trying to make yourself appealing by means of extravagant expenditure. So we have to take that into consideration. That's the first phase, is to really understand the imperative or the truth or the example in its own historical context. Let me give you another one, kind of a really big example that's sometimes completely misunderstood. In Genesis, Lot is visited by angels, and he takes him into his home, and he brings him into his home, and he gets attacked by the city, and these people of Sodom, they know that Lot is harboring these two men, and the people of Sodom want to come out to have sex with them. The town wants to rape these two guests. Now, Lot doesn't know they're angelic, but he, as being a good Middle Near Eastern man, he values hospitality to the point that he puts his two daughters out there as kind of bait to kind of satisfy the sexual needs of the crowds. Now, that's horrendous in our culture today. We would look on that to totally disgusted and detest Lot for offering that. In our context, to have a man offer up his daughters is basically to please a sexual crowd for the safety of two strangers is just horrendous. In Lot's day, it was bravery. He was being heroic. He was really going the extra mile, and it was seen as a positive thing. We can't possibly think that way, but we do have to understand that the example set in that time period means something completely different than it means to us today. And so that's what we mean by understanding whatever it is we're looking at in its own historical cultural context. The next phase is to restate it from a transcultural level. What I mean by that is, you've got this thing that's cultural, whether it's braiding of the hair or being hospitable. In Lot's case, it's an example of giving up your own daughters to be raped by a crowd. Those are cultural examples and imperative. Now, how do we restate that into a way that makes sense, whether you're in Sodom and Gomorrah or in San Diego? Well, what you have to do is take your understanding of its historical cultural context and then rephrase it in a way that applies anywhere. So you could say something like, in regards to braided hair, you could restate that transculturally by saying something like, don't spend a lot of money or time or effort into your physical appearance. Really make yourself appealing by doing good works. Or, in Lot's example of giving up his daughters is really take seriously your responsibility to be a good, hospitable person. Now, hospitality in our world is going to look completely different from Lot's, which leads us to the next phase, which you've got this transcultural universal principle. Well, now it's time to say, okay, what does this actually look like in my world? I'm a 21st century San Diegan, or wherever you're at. What does hospitality look like in my world? Or what does it look like to not spend a ton of money on my appearance? What are the things I would give up? And so you can contextualize it, and you're real specific at this point. You could say something like, I'm not going to drop hundreds of dollars on a phone. I'm not going to spend hundreds of dollars on a watch or thousands of dollars on a purse. Instead, I'm going to focus on just being a good servant to my community and make myself appealing that way. Hospitality, what does hospitality look like for you? For some, I know somebody personally who, for them, hospitality manifested in a way where they welcome the homeless into their life. And so even though they're not offering up their own children to satisfy the sexual needs of the community, their real life application is just to say, you know what, there's an incredible need here, and we're willing to sacrifice our own comfort and safety to let homeless people into our lives. And that's probably a little slightly more realistic contextualization of that application. But anyway, these are the 3 phases that we want to go through when we're applying something. Now, I actually have specific things I want to go into more detail in these. So let's look at each one of these phases more closely.